As I say, you are in for a treat this evening, and it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker, Anthony Bellov. Anthony is a native of Brooklyn and an Upper West Sider. He's a very conservative gentleman. So he's an award-winning videographer, classical pianist, and tenor. And I think he's doing all of that this evening. He is a singing teacher, a public speaker, an architectural historian and preservationist, and he has been called many things. Most recently, a domestic archaeologist, which is a compliment. Anthony has a bachelor's in architecture from Pratt and a master's in museum leadership from Bank Street College. He is a long-time spokesperson for the Merchants House Museum in the West Village and a board member of the American Research Center in Egypt. He's also, and most importantly, of course, a member of the Salmagundi Club. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce my friend and fellow Salmagundian, Anthony Bellov.
Well, good evening, everybody.
Good evening.
I'm so happy to see you all here. This doesn't fit. It's all right. Could we kill the lights, Brandon? Thanks. I want you to be able to see the splendor of this presentation tonight. Thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to be here. I'm very excited to share some of the information that I have discovered in this quest. There are a few people before we begin I need to point out immediately. I want to thank personally Bob Muller, who is the historian of the Salmagundi Club, because he so generously shared so much of his own research with me and just burdened me with all of this additional information I was not expecting. Thank you so much. I also want to point out Richard Moses, who unfortunately could not be here this evening. His 5-pound thesis, I waited. His 5-pound thesis on this house got me started and made me question the things that I was looking at and explained so many things to me. So we certainly could not do this without him as well. And I also want to thank personally Lynn Mandel, who is an amateur, a devoted amateur in the best sense of the word genealogist, who loaded me up with lots of other information about this building, which we did not know before, making my job even tougher. So thank you to all of them, and there'll be plenty of thanks at the end of the slideshow if we make it that far. I want to let you know that when I began this project, in my naivete, I thought with some judicious trimming, I'd be able to get to all 5/6 floors of the building in an hour. Well, let's say we'll be lucky if we get through this floor in an hour, because there is so much information to share about this building. So much, in fact, that, Dale, I've now been asked to make this a series. So this is now part 1 of Before Salmagundi. So here we go, and I'm going to try very hard to get through as much of this as I can before we get booted out of this room promptly at 7:30. What makes this building so important? Everybody knows it's important, but why? There are certainly older buildings in Manhattan, there are more lavish mansions uptown, and there are places where events of national historical importance occurred, none of which fits the bill here. But there is only one building like this remaining standing today. This is truly the very last of a kind. The only pre-Civil War Fifth Avenue mansion standing today. And not only standing, but so intact inside. And that's what's so significant. It's truly a miracle that this building remains in as good condition inside as it does. Built in 1853, nobody asked me that question. Built in 1853, it's the only example left of the great era when Fifth Avenue was still battling it out with other neighborhoods for the crown of best address. This building is pre-Gilded Age. This is pre the 400. This is pre-Vanderbilt Palaces. This is even pre-Mrs. Astor. The surviving details tell us more about those times than any diaries or newspapers ever could. Just by walking in the door today, we can see, sense, and touch what everyone else back in the day could only dream about. So this is the earliest photograph we have of the Salmagundi Club. It's part of a panoramic tour of Fifth Avenue taken up to the low 90s back in 1911. Dale? And that is a highlight of the actual Salmagundi Club. As I said, this is the earliest photograph we have of the building. And we'll talk about this ad nauseum in the next 55 minutes or so. Now, what exactly is Salmagundi? People ask me this question all the time. It is a general mixture, a miscellaneous collection of disparate things, a medley, a potpourri. So, no, that's a Salmagundi salad. That's not what we're going to talk about. We are going to have a Salmagundi about Salmagundi. So where are we right now? This is the room we're sitting in. Mind you, the clubhouse is not an historic house museum. This is not a building frozen in time. Over the 169 years that this building has been standing, it has been many things to many different people, but always very vital. And so we've not restored it. We've not tried to recreate any previous period in the building's history. The room you're standing in right now is formerly the rear yard of this building. So I climbed up on the roof of this actual gallery and I took a photo of the back of the building. In 1853, that's what the neighbors saw. And I looked at it and I said, I wouldn't mind it if the front of my house looked like this. But the rear yard of a building back in the day served a variety of different things depending upon the people who were living in the building. It could have been workspaces, the way you see in this photo by Victor Prevost around 1855. This is just a few blocks north of here on 28th Street, looking back down towards Madison Square. So it could have been a workspace, it could have been very plain and unattractive, or it could have been gorgeous. Now, I looked at this, I said, oh yeah, that's what my family would have as a background. But this is a townhouse in Chelsea, and it was the former Edwin Forrest residence. The Drummonds lived here in the late 19th century, and they obviously had a great time. So just to give you an idea of what the space is that we're sitting in now, you're sitting in the backyard. We need to review the time frame for the building. It's a complicated time frame, and so there will be a quiz at the end of this evening. From 1853 until 1893, it was owned by Arid and Sarah Hawley and/or their family. In 1893, after Sarah's passing, it was sold to William Gray and Elizabeth Park and family. And although they resided here until 1909, they continued to own it for almost another 10 years. In 1905, the family rented the house out to Winthrop Astor and Margaret Chandler and family. Aha, that's not a name you're all hearing about. And here's another one that's unrecognizable. From 1906 to 1909, almost 4 years in length, Thomas H. and Emerance Kelly owned the house. And boy, do I have stories about these people, which we probably will not get to tonight. Just sort of coaxing you into returning for the next one. In 1910, believe it or not, this became a boarding house and remained one for the next 5 years until 1915. And at which time, a woman named Sidney Colstock took over management of the Dunscombe and made it the Old Chelsea. And she is really a character too, let me tell you. Very involved with women's rights and the right to vote. and she knew everybody and everything that involved the suffrage movement. Moving right along. 1917, the Park Estate sold the house to, I don't know, this club with a really strange name. And they own it to this day. In 1853, in February, Ira Hawley bought the 2 remaining empty lots fronting on the east side of Fifth Avenue between 11th and 12th Streets, on the east side of Fifth Avenue, as I said, for a total of $16,600. Now, I know the comparison doesn't work exactly, but what does that mean? So according to the formulas online, that amounts to $640,000 today. Now we know that just the empty lot is going to cost way more than that, but $640,000 ain't exactly pocket change either. Work began promptly on the house, and you can see it. How to find the house on maps? Look for First Presbyterian Church on Fifth Avenue, because it has that whole block front. And right across the street from it, that house with the little protrusion in the back, that is 47 Fifth Avenue. And you can see if you compare it to the row houses on the side streets, those are standard 25-foot wide row houses on the side streets. So you really get an idea of just how impressive this structure was. Work began promptly in 1853, but we don't have a record of them as actually living in the building until 1855, which means they could have moved in sometime late in 1854. Takes time to build a building this grand, folks, and back then even more so. There was probably no architect, although the house is very high-end and skillfully designed. Wait a minute, did Anthony just say there was no architect? It's not uncommon for houses at this time in history to be designed by a builder instead. Although we tried, Carol Teller and I were down in the buildings department, we tried to find the name of the builder, but their records don't go back this far, naturally. So the builder is unknown, but I must say he was a very skillful designer on his own. But basically, this is your mid-19th century cookie-cutter mansion. Oh, forgive me. Buildings like this appeared all along Fifth Avenue and 14th Street, and the environs as far north as Madison Square at this time. The design sources in the day were pattern books. Most of you probably know that. Builders had a variety of different books showing designs and formulae for designing the mathematical equations for how certain cornices were supposed to be laid out. So that's what I mean when I say it was cookie cutter. But it's great for me to say today when there's only one cookie left in the cookie jar. At any rate, this particular house was custom built for the Hawleys since they hired the builder. And so there are uniquenesses, if there is such a word, in this building which would have been their specs to the builder. So they made the final decisions in this building. How does it differ from other buildings of the era? We don't know. Because, everybody repeat after me, this is the only one left. So in the standard mansion plan, you've got 2 major rooms facing back to back. And I won't explain that white space in the middle tonight, but let's just say, depending on what floor you were looking at, there would have been a complex of small service rooms between the 2 major rooms. There would have also been 2 secondary rooms. So right here, you're talking about serious space, especially in this particular house. On the ground floor, that lighter green would be the entrance that you all, not the ground floor, the main floor, would have been that entrance that you all walked into just previously. And then finally, there is a central circulation corridor with a main staircase. In the case of this house, there's also a servant staircase. And from the 2nd floor up, there was a bathroom on every floor. So anyway, who was this guy, Ira Hawley, and how did he pay for this palace? Ira made his fortune basically in food, coal, and railroads. He was born in Ridgefield, Connecticut in 1793 in his grandfather's house. The Hawley homestead on Main Street in Ridgefield is the oldest house standing in Ridgefield today, built in 1733. At the age of 14, Ira moved to New York for a career in retailing. He served with distinction in the War of 1812. He would have been 19 at that time. And he established a prosperous grocery import firm, Holmes, Hawley and Company. And in 1819, he married the lovely Sarah Holmes, the daughter of his partner. They were about 8 years difference in age. She was born in 1801, lived until 1891. And Irid was born in 1793 and lived until 1865. They had 7 children, 5 boys and 2 girls. It's a long-lived family. They lived well into their 80s at very least. In 1828, Irid was elected the first captain of the first company of the first Order of the National Guard. So Irid was basically one of the people who founded the National Guard. They lived in a series of homes in today's Lower East Side, Oak Street, Oliver Street, Rutgers Place, none of them especially outstanding, and none of them sadly are still standing today. In 1841, he retired from his company, from Holmes and Hawley, with an ample fortune. By 1827, he had already founded the town of Hawley in the Poconos because he had begun investing in coal. Heavily in coal, I should say, and in railroads. And he became the first president of the Pennsylvania Coal Company, and they used a coal-carrying gravity railroad. The weight of the coal would make the railroad just rotate constantly so they could move the coal to the Delaware and Hudson Canal, of which he was also a director, to bring coal to New York. So he basically owned the mines, he owned the railroad that brought the coal to the barges, he owned the barges, and he probably had free coal in his house. That would be my guess. He didn't have to worry about the coal supply in this building. He was a director of the Boston and Providence and the Chicago and Rock Island Railroads as well. And as you know, in 1853, he built 47 Fifth as his retirement home. And he settled in comfortably with most of his family, but he only lived here for less than a decade. The couple with Lavinia took an extended trip to Europe in 1862 because of his poor health. He was 70 at that time, almost 70, and he died of typhoid in Rome in 1865 at the age of 72, just a few days after Lincoln was assassinated. But because of the slowness of news in the day, he died before news reached Rome that Lincoln had been assassinated. The family remained, and they watched society march uptown. Lower Fifth Avenue became a sleepy, sedate, old-fashioned backwater. Sarah passed at the age of 90 in 1891. They were a quiet family, not disposed to making a big splash and appearing in the society columns. They basically stayed to themselves. They were charitable, old-fashioned conservative. He was a staunch New Englander, and it really shows in his demeanor. But one of them was an embezzler. In 1870, Daniel Edwin, Elisha's brother, discovered that Elisha had been misappropriating funds from the family estate to float the tea import business they both worked for. The sum amounted in 1870 to over $200,000, which is the incredible of well over $4 million today. To avoid prosecution, they arranged to refund the money, which depleted the Hawley estate substantially. That's Sing Sing. That's where Elisha would be going if they had agreed to reimburse the money. The problem with this is that Mama Sarah's annual income was reduced from $10,000 to $4,000 a year because the estate had been depleted. But that still comes to $95,000 or so today. So don't feel too badly for Sarah. Plus, all her kids were living there too. So they were all chipping in, I would like to think. They finally sold the house in 1893, 2 years after Sarah's passing. So let's talk about the building a little bit. The building is a city landmark and on the National Register, and it is built in the Italianate, aka the Palazzo style. This building was cutting-edge architecture in 1853. The exterior really shows all the hallmarks of Italianate architecture. And thank you, Brownstoner, for that background, by the way. But Those scrolls, those acanthus leafy scrolls, are pretty much the signature of an Italianate building. If you see a building from the mid-19th century just dripping in that sort of detail, it can't be anything else. The Italianate reacted against the plainness and the low-key charm of earlier styles, such as the Federal, the Greek Revival, and the Gothic Revival. Now, I do want you to notice that there's a certain change of coloration here. We're going to talk about that in a few moments. But the lush details of the Italianate were both an indication of the great prosperity in the country, or at least in New York at that time, and also a certain willingness for the wealthy to begin flaunting their wealth. Earlier in the century, it was not done as much. It was a question of materials. Now it just became a question of more is more. This is Victorian America we're talking about here. The very first Italianate building was designed in London, naturally, by Sir Charles Barry, whose name may be familiar to you since he designed the Houses of Parliament, in 1826. Nothing quite like this had ever been designed before. It still stands, it's still the Travelers Club. In Philadelphia, the Athenaeum went up in 1845. That's almost 20 years later. It took that long for the Italianate to make it from London to America. And it didn't make it to New York first, it made it to Philly. This was designed by John Notman. Oh, we got to this, okay, it's fine, this is where I was going. This is the A.T. Stewart store, built in 1846 on Chambers Street in New York. I'm happy to say all three of these buildings are still standing, but there's something significant in the fact that the first two buildings we looked at were private membership clubs, both with extremely important libraries, and the first Italianate building in New York was a department store. Enough said. Brownstone. I sort of alluded to the significance of brownstone. Yes, this is a very pretty photo. But brownstone was all the rage when it was first introduced as to be used as a full facade material. It was used for at least a century before on the East Coast, but as foundation stones for lintels over windows, that sort of thing, but never as a full facade. But classical buildings should be light colored. I think we all understand that. But brownstone was not only very dark and romantic, and this was really the height of the Romantic movement, so it really fit the whole cultural trappings of the era. But brownstone was a local stone. It was very easy to quarry, very cheap, and very easy to carve. So there you have it. Unfortunately, it also weathers away very easily. So not only is it inappropriate for classical buildings, but it's a lousy material to put on the outside of your building. And before long, it also became quite monotonous. For about 2 miles up the island, everything was brown. And the city really turned into chocolate after a while. And many architectural critics began complaining about this because there was sort of the brick zone up to around Washington Square, and then there was a bit of overlapping up to around 14th Street, and then it was brown all the way up into what we now call Midtown. And brownstone could get oppressive. By the 1880s, the style had run its course at any rate and was considered very old-fashioned. Now here's a photo from 1925, and you get a better sense of the facade of the building itself. All of the Italianate markers are there. There's scrolled foliage brackets, the arched door, brownstone material, scrolled wooden cornice, grandiose stoop, and deep window surrounds. You'll also notice, those of you who are familiar with the building, that the stoop railing and the railings on the balconies and around the lawn, which you can see of it, don't correspond to what's there today. By the 1930s, the banisters on each side of the stoop were filled in, probably because the urns that were holding up the banister were decaying, because we think they were brownstone. If they weren't brownstone, they were cast iron, and that was decaying as well. If you walk through sections of Brooklyn where restoration is not as rampant, forgive the choice of the word, you'll see a lot of brownstone buildings in not great condition. And after about 80 years or so, this building was beginning to show its age as well. So the railings on the balconies have been replaced, the cast iron railing around the front yard have been replaced, and the banisters of the stoop are now solid. It's just important that I mention that to you. The building is an extra width, which is why you have those extra rooms inside it. The lot is 39.3, so almost 40 feet wide by 125 feet deep. You've got the 4 windows going across the front. When we say 4 bays, we mean 4 windows. And you've got the extra height that the style called for with these high ceilings inside. So this now looks like a little shrimp next to the apartment houses on each side, but at the time, it was a very imposing building. The front door, and I'm going to quote from Richard Moses' 5-pound thesis. The entrance is framed by an ornate pedimented arch surround. A pair of acanthus leaf consoles above pilaster strips supports impost blocks beneath the pediment. Between these blocks runs a set of medallions. Smaller acanthus leaf consoles support the arch at its spring line. The archivolt here consists of an egg and dart molding broken by a dropped keystone with an acanthus leaf face. Behind this arch is a narrow outer vestibule which leads to the double doors of the entrance hall. So the only other thing I wanted to point out to you about the facade, take a good look at it because you can see really the difference between this and those earlier brick buildings that I showed you. The heavy surrounds around the window, that very bold, very boastful front entrance. It really says you are arriving someplace. And then way up on the top, it has a wonderful carved wooden cornice. That cornice originally would have been painted with sand paint, so it blended in with the brownstone. It didn't look like wood. Many buildings were already beginning to use pressed metal cornices at this time, which was a lot cheaper and did not hold up as well as long as you kept it painted. What is also significant, if you think back to that photo you just saw, is you can no longer detect the individual brownstone blocks on the facade. That's because in the 1990s, the building was in condition warranting what we call parging. They took a cementitious material colored to look like brownstone and just went right over the whole facade. So unfortunately, because of that, you lose that sense of individual blocks and with all the graining, the little variations in tone in the blocks, but you also lose all the peeling and smalling and falling apart and walking up the stairs every morning seeing little pieces of brownstone at the front door. What are you going to do? Bad choice of material. I also want to point out to you the brackets holding up the cornices. So those scrolls are right down there at ground level as well. And if you're paying attention when you walk by, this is what you see. These are reproductions. The originals were cast iron and they were in dreadful condition by the 1990s, but these are exact casts of them in fiberglass. And I'm sure they would have been fiberglass in 1853 had that existed. Come on in. Let's walk in through the front doors and let's take a better look at this floor plan. Here again is the floor plan of 47 Fifth, and let's compare it to a typical row house plan. This is the plan of the Merchant's House Museum, where you've heard I'm also very active. Dale, can we flip this? Thank you. This way the plans correspond. You see the Merchant's House has the double parlors. Here at 47 Fifth, the double parlors are sort of indicated, not quite as clearly differentiated any longer. And then there's that long hall, which in the Merchant's House, a typical 25-foot wide row house, is a side hall. In a 40-foot wide 4-bay row house, it's more of a central hall. And as a result of all that extra space, you can do something really creative with the staircase instead of just having it sort of wedged there into the corner. When you walk in today, you see something you would not have seen in 1853. Your sight line immediately is cut off by a colonial revival arch. These arches, believe it or not, were installed in 1956. The city wanted Salmagundi to tear down the main staircase because it was a fire hazard. After a great deal of negotiating, the club agreed to put in fire doors on each side of the stairwell. They also put in an extremely elaborate water sprinkler system. So happily, we were spared having to replace that magnificent staircase, but what we lose is that sight line, where when you first walked in there, you would be treated to these three magnificent ceilings just stretching one after the other right down the hallway, and you would see them right from the front door. Now what you see instead are those archways. A happy compromise, but we've lost the experience of what would have been before 1956. But that's the staircase that got saved. So I think that the irony is that I don't know where those fire doors are now. They're wide open and it's just the enframetment that's still there, so maybe they've been deemed unnecessary at this point. But here's your 1853 staircase anyway. When you continue back towards the rear hallway, you'll see different layers. This is what I mean by a building that's been used throughout the years. The arched doorway with that sort of scalloped edge to it. You see a complete one there with a funny modern door stuck into it, and you'll see the archway of the rear doorway, which opens into this gallery. That's 1853, as well as the marble floor. But in 1917, when Salmagundi bought the house, they wanted to modernize it, because this was just sort of old fuddy-duddy Victorian detailing at that time. So they installed that arch on the rear door, and you'll see it elsewhere too. If you look up at the top of this, you'll see it. And you can see the remnants of the arch leading into the rear parlor. And if you look closely, hopefully you can all see this, the fire door from 1956 rams right into the 1853 molding. So you see the scalloping sticking out on the side, right next to that painting. There's a little line of scallop going up. That's 1853, with 1956 sort of wrestling it to the ground. But here's an example of the 1917 updating. That's looking back at the front door. And you see these pilasters with Corinthian capitals all over the main floor of the building. That's 1917. But Salmagundi was respectful. They took the colonial revival arches, which was all the rage in 1917, so it would be modern, even though it's a much older style than what they're covering up. And they fit them around the 1853 arches. So the arches are back there behind those. And then the pilasters fit over the side moldings of the doors. So in 1917, they respected the original 1853 fabric, they just didn't want to look at it anymore. Now, as we walked in, if we were casual visitors, the first place we would go is to that little green room, which back in the day was the reception room. This is where your coats are hanging today. It would be a place where people would be greeted. It's a sensational room all by itself. It's a little hard to see the detailing with this intensely saturated green, but it's such a gorgeous color. But the room almost has an 18th century feel to it. There's two recesses in the walls with scrolls. There's this amazing ceiling, and then this is the only doorway, although it's missing its rosewood door. This is the only door enfraintment on the main floor that remains intact. You can see what was originally above the door. If you look, you can see that paneled sort of infill. So the doors were rectangular, and then there was a paneling over them. That's the only one that's left today. The mantelpiece in this room is very pretty, but it's not original to this room. There would have been a much grander mantle in this room in 1853, because people are walking in, you need to impress them, hey, right away. So there would be a mantle similar to the ones you saw in the parlors. This mantle replaced the one that was missing. Where it went, when it went, I don't know. But this mantle came downstairs from one of the third floor bedrooms. And I know which one, but I'm not going to tell you today. I also want to mention that there was originally a gas chandelier hanging from the ceiling of this room. There's also a French door that opens onto a balcony, which is a half-size version of the balcony along the front of the parlors as well. Let's talk about that grand staircase, if you please. That purple represents the circulation area on the main floor of the building. And the staircase, you already saw one photo, But this staircase, now of course, if we were visitors at the time, you know, we would be walking up the staircase and we would try very hard not to do that, but we really want to do that because up at the top of the staircase, and you can see what remains of it in this photo, was an amazing dome with a skylight in the middle of it that looks like an oculus. I call that the Pantheon on Fifth Avenue. Was that unique? It is now, but did other people have that at the time? We don't know, because there's not another one surviving. There was stained glass there at one time. That's a different tour, excuse me. Yes, there was stained glass there. Different part to this talk. The staircase is cantilevered, it's imposing, it's massive, it's soaring, it's lit by that amazing dome skylight. And I wonder how many of you have ever bothered to look at the balusters on the staircase and realize that they're hand carved. And there are an awful lot of them. I kept meaning to count them, and happy hour would come along and I'd sort of forget. But I do invite one of you at some point to count all the balusters in the staircase, and do let me know how many there are, because I'm guaranteed we'll forget again. Now we have a detective story. This photograph on the diagonal is the stairs going down to the basement, where hopefully many of you will retreat after this is over. Those of you who've walked in it before know that is a very creaky staircase. When you get to the turn to come back around on itself, the rear wall, the wall against the foundation, is beadboard. And I remember the first time walking down those stairs and saying, huh, what's this all about? There's something really odd here. Plus, it's very, very wide, and the entrance of the staircase is right next to the entrance to the next floor. Very unusual for a residence. Why would you advertise, come on down here to the basement? You know, your grand guests were not going to go to the basement. I also can't help but notice that right next to Dulcie's desk is this joint, this very clumsily done joint in the banister, in the handrail. There are other joints, what we call a butt joint, in the handrail, but they're very, very tight, very, very smooth. This one is anything but. And so a flag went up in my head. And then looking at this main newel post, and I'm sorry to say this newel post really shows its age. It's missing details, it's been really kicked around. And one of my pet projects someday would be to figure out how we can restore this newel post. But if you look around at the other side, you can see that the handrail leading to the basement sort of just kind of slams into it. And I have a detail to show you too. You see the way it just barrels right into that sort of double arch there, and there should be a little trefoil drop on that side too. And if you look closely at the banister, there's also a big piece taken out of it, which told me that that banister was configured somewhere in a very different way. So I became very curious. Now you saw a picture of Dara Park, the son of the Parks, who visited the house when he was middle-aged. He lived here until he was 11. And one of the things he said when walking through the house was, you moved the staircase. So that was kind of the smoking gun. And I went to the old plans. Now, happily for Richard Moses's 1986 thesis, he photocopied the plans that existed in the Department of Buildings from 1910, when the building was converted from a private house to a boarding house. When we tried to find these plans in August, they could not locate them. They are missing. But they did find the 1917 plans when the boarding house was converted to Salmagundi. And the woman in charge of the office said, "Where'd you find those?" And I said, "They were right here in the folder." She said, "Well, we have no record of them." So, welcome to New York and the buildings department. But anyway, moving right along, I took a look at the detail in 1910, and I saw that the configuration of that staircase is different than it is today. Now, just to translate, if you move up just slightly from the bottom of that enlargement, you see a flight of stairs. And the flight of stairs, if you're walking up from the basement, you turn to the right and you continue up a little bit. So it would be an L-shaped climb. In the 1917 plans, And we'll take a look at the detail of those. Thank you. This is the main floor. There is the flight of stairs right next to the other flight of stairs. The one on the bottom is the staircase going up to the second floor, to the library floor. The one more to the middle of that enlargement is the staircase that exists today going down. That was not there in 1910. Not only that, but it says new stairs on it. So, ta-da, the mystery was solved. The stairs were reconfigured in 1917 when Salmagundi made this into their clubhouse. And it makes sense because they were using the basement in a very different way than had been used prior. And they wanted people to be able to get up and down. Hey, there's pool tables downstairs. You know, you need to be able to get there. So here's an image of the staircase today. And I'm about to show you a conjectural recreation of what it looked like in 1853. Sir?
Wow.
So you can see the difference, and you can see how the function of that space is quite different in 1853 than it is today. I'm not saying one is right and one is wrong, and certainly we would not want to recreate 1853 today because it would be a Dickens to get downstairs to have dinner after this talk. But anyway, that's my guess at what it looked like at the time. Yeah. Now, in the early times, we would have been ushered into the parlors. But I want to talk about this room. Not this room, that room, right there, the sort of annex to this room, because people don't realize that that was the family's formal dining room. This is what it looks like today. And you can see that back wall is wide open and it goes right back into this room that we're sitting in now. But I suspected that it was very different at one time. And one of the giveaways is that amazing Gothic ceiling. It is just gorgeous. It's very deep, it's very sculptural, and it happens to be wonderfully well preserved. And there's two doors in the corner of that room which are Gothic. If you look at them closely, you'll notice that the one on the right doesn't entirely match the one on the left. There's tracery on the one on the left, which is not on the one on the right. And that made me a little curious too. And there's also evidence that the door on the right was wider than the door that was originally in that frame. They had to modify the frame. So again, my detective flags went up. I also noticed that the door at the end of that hallway does not have rosewood on it, the way the doors to the parlors do. And certainly in 1853 it did. There's also a hint with that fireplace, because I've always looked at that fireplace and said, wow, this is kind of an understatement. When you compare it to the fireplaces in the front of the house, this just doesn't really make sense. But doing a little bit of research now, mind you, this next slide is going to be fudged. But I think it looked way more like this. There was a surround that was removed at some point in the past. If you look out in the courtyard, those two windows that are circled in red are windows that open into the original dining room that are now sealed up today. So there are French windows there as well. So, you know, again, all sorts of flags were going up, and I said, all right, things were different at some time in the past. And once again, I consulted the plans. Now, interestingly enough, the one on the left, the 1910 plan, does not show windows on that right side wall, but the plan in 1917 does. That makes no sense. After 1910, the Dunscombe did not add windows to that room, so that's a mistake in the 1910 plans. It's just that simple. At some point in the past, windows were added, but because of the size of the windows, looking at them from the outside, they don't have the brownstone lintels over them, they were added after 1853. Those windows would have had Gothic surrounds around them too. And then there's a doorway missing, where we have that kind of secret door now, where we keep all the chairs and everything. That was originally the butler's pantry, and there would have been a matching Gothic door at that side of the rear wall as well. And that's probably where the door that's now opening onto the hallway comes from. So before 1910, I think the room looked something like this. Now, why before 1910? because when it became a boarding house, that door on the right was removed, and a bathroom and a cedar closet was installed in the space between the fireplace and that back wall, because that room needed to have a closet. This was also one of the first rooms in the house to be electrified. And so this was a prime room during the boarding house years. And I suspect at that point, the surround was removed from the fireplace just to give the occupant more room to move around. Yeah. Now, you already saw this photo, but that back wall, this opening right here, was actually blown out in 1901 by Park, who had his nephew, Algernon Bell, as the architect, install a wall of metal tracery windows in there. Let's see what it looked like. Oh. Now, these windows faced the building next door. It was still a private house here, 45 Fifth Avenue, which was built in 1852. And we know their backyard must have been pretty, otherwise, why put those windows into the backyard? But that steel beam that was put in there to open that wall made it very easy for Salmagundi to add this room in 1917 and not have to make any adjustments. Okay. But I want to talk about a sensational party that took place in what was formerly the dining room. Thomas H. Kelly, right there, was the occupant of this house along with his wife from 1906 to 1909. Fabulously wealthy, fabulously important Irish family. They were largely responsible, they basically paid for the construction of the Lady Chapel at St. Patrick's Cathedral out of their own pocket. He was very good friends with two popes, naturally, and he was the papal chamberlain at the centennial celebration of St. Patrick's Cathedral held in April 1908, where this photo comes from. Thank you very much, Bob Muller. The Cardinal, he hosted what was probably the single most elaborate event this house has ever seen. To wrap up the week of celebrations, he threw a dinner for Cardinal Logue and 30 guests on Friday, May 1st, 1908. And I'm going to quote from the New York Herald of May 2nd, 1908. The Cardinal and the guests arrived at 7 p.m. just at sunset, where over the entrance was placed a Della Robbia panel of blue and white, representing the Annunciation, and the outer walls of brownstone as far as the second story were covered with festoons of laurel, draped about shields bearing papal emblems. I'd love to see a photograph of that decoration. The dinner consisted of sumptuous seafood, because it was a Friday, and the grand finale was a 4-foot-high centerpiece of the Cardinal, excuse me, made out of scarlet spun sugar created by the pastry chef of the Hotel Knickerbocker, surrounded by heaps of crushed ice and pêche Cardinal, which is poached peaches in raspberry sauce. The figure's pectoral cross was iridescent candy, and the face was nougat. 2 butlers carried it in on a heavy silver tray, and following dinner, a reception was held in the Cardinal's honor, filling the house with 300 guests. Yeah, that was a party that I would like to have attended. Let's see how far we can get now before I have to stop. The best room in the house, the parlor. Those parlors are almost intact. In fact, they've been enhanced a little bit by Salmagundi by adding those arches, by updating the space. It is a traditional double parlor in a certain sense, but the sides are wide open, so you've got that divider. It's a vestigial remainder of a time when parlors were divided. This is a photo of the double parlors at the Merchant's House about 20 years ago in this building. And you can see into the front parlor from the back parlor, but they are distinctly divided. Now that's a 25-foot wide house. So this is a 40-foot wide house. So maybe you didn't need to be quite so strict about your parlor use because you had essentially a third parlor, the dining room. So you could open that parlor up and have sort of an open plan for living. Here is a double parlor from 1852 at 29 West 22nd Street. And if you can make that out, you can see that the parlors are divided. That's a 25-foot wide row house, but the parlors are divided along the top. But even the columns are gone by that point, and it's just two little side arches and then a big arch in the middle with a foliate decoration where the capitals should be. So by the 1850s, this was not that unusual. But in the William Havemeyer, yeah, okay, we've got 5 minutes, so let's see how I can. Yeah, 5 minutes, folks. The William Havemeyer double parlors in his house in 335 West 14th Street, 1844. And yet you can see the parlors are wide open. It's the same idea with columns between the two parlors, but we have an arch. He only has a straight entablature. So there was an evolution, if the house was big enough, and this was one of the first of the 40-foot wide townhouses. It was on 14th Street. You could do that if you wanted to. So it was very chic, but not mandatory, and probably just a little bit revolutionary. But when you look at the mantelpieces and the ceiling decoration in the two rooms, you see that there is still a hierarchy. The front parlor, which is on the left, is just slightly more ornate than the rear parlor on the right. Even though you can see both of them, there's still, as I said, this sort of vestigial trace of the former double parlors. By the way, arched fireplaces like this, absolutely typical of Italianate buildings. If you see a fireplace like this and they tell you the house was built in 1812, then you say, all right, the house was, but the fireplace wasn't. And speaking of fireplaces, at least 19 of the fireplaces in this building were built to burn coal. There's a 20th one right there in the old dining room, which I believe is a wood-burning fireplace, which would be great for a dinner around the table, you know, with this, all of these Elizabethan details and the fire roaring. It would have been wonderful. By the way, the heaviness of all this detail, it reads heavy to us today with electrical lighting, but I like to try to imagine what it would look like in 1853 with a gasolier and with oil lamps and candles illuminating it. It would have popped, and all of this detail would have made wonderful kind of twirly shadows and that sort of thing. It would have just been really spectacular. I want to call your attention to the extreme accuracy of the detailing. Now, all the egg dart and the acanthus leaf detailing is probably store-bought. The local plastermonger who specialized in these houses had patterns ready to go, and he was able to make suggestions as to how to put it all together. Notice I'm not even talking about the rosette, which is amazing, the gasolier rosette. But if you look closely at it, you will see they all line up. You see the way they butt up against each other, and in the lower slide where the molding comes out, you see the way the acanthus leaf, the two mitered edges of the acanthus leaf, fold around the corner. Very appropriate for a house like this, since this is a fine arts club. And that's what you would expect from a fine picture frame. So the precision and the calculation that went into where all these pieces go and how long something needed to be so that you didn't get this funny little residual somewhere. These people really knew what they were doing. Now a little more sleuthing, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap up. But the first time I walked into the rear parlor many years ago, I noticed that one of the doorways had a sort of a box, monumental sort of plaque-looking thing over it, and the other one didn't. I thought it was very odd that the room was so out of balance. Yeah. It's 7:30, I guess. I wondered why one door had it and one door didn't until I saw this photo from Richard Moses' thesis, which shows the door closer to you with a plaque over it as well. This was just a different way of masking those Victorian arches behind it. Unfortunately, at some point, the cover on the door nearest to you was removed. We don't know when. Nobody recalls when it was done. Possibly when that AC unit was installed. But when that was done, that architectural detail, as well as the Victorian arch underneath it, were removed. Now, where are they today? I pray that they are either upstairs or down in the cellar somewhere stored away, and that they weren't just trashed. But one other thing I noticed, which saddened me, is again, some point in the past, a modern deadbolt lock was drilled through this rosewood door. Now we need a lock on the door, but I just looked at this and my heart sunk. And I said, there must have been an alternative to doing this. These are rosewood doors. They date to 1853. Would you do this to a rosewood armoire from 1853? Not only is this damaging irreparably an antique item, but rosewood is also a controlled substance now. This cannot be replaced. A rosewood door is irreplaceable because you cannot trade in rosewood anymore. And enough of these doors have vanished in the house, so I say, please, no more of this. Yeah. On the lighter side, I do want you to notice when you look at that door and say, Anthony was right, they drilled right through it. There's also a call button on that side, painted over. And there are many call buttons scattered throughout the house. They all date to 1917. And my question is, how many can you find? So Dale, if you'll just move ahead, we're almost done. Let's wrap up with Lavinia and Sarah having tea in their front parlor. And part of the reason I want to show this is because it's an amazing photograph. How does this survive? I've spoken to Hawley Johnson, who is the great-granddaughter of Irid and Sarah, and she's been trying to find other photos from the house for us, and so far no luck. But I want you to notice the heavy curtains, the gilt brass decorations around the windows. Notice the ceiling and the way it's picked out in paint. It's outlined in paint. And most especially, notice all the paintings on the walls. This is a tradition that goes back to 1853. So I almost got through it all. All these people deserve being thanked for their help in tonight's talk. And let's plan on picking up where I left off next time. Downstairs, so
And please, it's turned off, but one more round of applause for